The prairie held its breath the night Nokomi's fled, as if the wind itself understood the weight she carried in her small, trembling body. Dusky violet clouds rolled low across the heavens, heavy with unshed rain, and their shadows stretched over the earth like giants bowing in sympathy. I remember the way she moved, quick, barefoot steps whispering through the dry grass, each one stitched with desperation and a trembling hope she barely dared to name. Even then, beneath that darkling sky, something in her eyes flickered like a question, as though she wondered whether the world had ever meant to offer her more than sorrow, and whether she had been wrong to believe it never would. The uncertainty pressed against her ribs as the first cold drop of rain struck her cheek, urging her forward into the waiting night, where danger and possibility mingled like smoke in the air. The house she left behind had never been a home, only a penance built from another woman's bitterness. Martha Crowden's voice followed her everywhere within those warped wooden walls, harsh as a whip crack and twice as unforgiving. A burden, she called her, a leftover responsibility from the mother who died before she could teach Nokomis how to belong to anything. Chores spilled across each day like a punishment carved into time, hauling water until her arms throbbed, scrubbing floors until her knuckles burned, and feeding a man she feared more than the shadows outside, Silas Crowden, Martha's brother, a man whose smile always sagged under addiction and danger. The townspeople watched her with weary pity but did nothing, their silence a reminder that she was alone in every direction she turned. She sensed something shifting the day Silas took coins in exchange for whispered promises, and curiosity, quiet, unwelcome, pricked her mind as she wondered what those coins meant for her fate. Then the answer arrived in the icy announcement that she was to be his bride. The words stuck in her throat like a stone as she looked upon Silas's glassy eyes and realized that no one would save her but herself. She ran when the sky broke open, the storm answering her courage with its own unrestrained fury. Rain blurred the world to watercolor smears, and thunder chased her across the prairie like a hound determined to pull secrets from the dark. For a moment she faltered, gripping the thin shawl around her shoulders, unsure where her trembling feet meant to take her. Then she remembered the cowboy with dust-colored eyes, Ahuli Ward, who had once lifted her dropped glove from the churchyard dust and given it back without judgment, his voice soft enough to feel like safety. She had replayed that moment more times than she cared to admit, wondering why a stranger's gentleness lingered when so much else in her life faded. And as she trudged through mud and wind, curiosity wound itself around her fear, whispering why his memory had chosen this moment to bloom. Lightning split the sky above as she spotted the faint outline of his cabin, a lone shape carved against the storm's howling mouth. She reached his door just as her strength thinned to a thread. The cabin's lamplight glowed warm through the cracks, promising respite from the cold that gnawed at her bones. Her hand trembled as she knocked, each heartbeat loud enough to feel like thunder living inside her chest. When Ahuli opened the door, he carried that same quiet stillness she remembered, the kind that made a person breathe more gently without knowing why. His gaze swept over her soaked dress and frightened eyes, yet he did not ask her to explain. He simply stepped aside, letting her cross the threshold as if he'd always intended to save her. The air inside smelled of cedar and sage, wrapping around her like a blanket heavier than the one he placed across her shoulders moments later. She watched him move, calm, patient, as he brewed tea and left it beside her without a word, and she felt a question rise within her about why she trusted him when trust had never come easily. But before she could name that thought, the distant sound of horses thundered through the night air. Ahuli heard it too. His jaw tightened, though he kept his voice steady as he asked her the name she feared to speak. When she whispered, "Silas," something subtle shifted in him, an understanding, an old grief of his own perhaps, though she couldn't be sure. Outside, lanterns bobbed through sheets of rain, each one a moving threat as the red ramblers approached with curses and slurred demands. Silas shouted her name as though he owned it, his voice cracking with rage and intoxication. Ahuli stepped outside into the storm, the brim of his hat dripping rain like melted silver, and stood between her and the gang with a quiet resolve that needed no weapon to be understood. He didn't shout, he didn't posture, he simply told Silas that Nokomis was under his protection now, and no one would lay a hand on her tonight. Curiosity flickered through the gang's eyes as they saw the calm steadiness of a man who fought only when he must, and fought well. Silas snarled, but he saw the shift in his own men's posture, their fear outweighing their loyalty. He spat into the mud, promising reckoning before riding off into the storm, leaving echoes of his anger hanging in the air like smoke. The storm softened toward dawn, its rage giving way to the fragile hush that follows a night of fear. Nokomis awoke to a golden sliver of sunlight peeking through the cabin window, illuminating the steam rising from a fresh cup of tea left on the table. Ahuli sat by the hearth, polishing a bridle with the calm concentration of a man who had learned to mend things quietly, perhaps because he'd once been broken himself. She watched him and felt something warm unfurl in her chest, unfamiliar yet gentle. Later she offered to help with chores around the ranch, needing to move to give something back. Together they fixed a barn hinge, their hands brushing like hesitant birds learning to share a branch. She noticed the way he gave her space yet stayed near enough to anchor her, and he noticed the way she flinched less with each hour that passed. Curiosity curled through those moments, asking whether two wounded souls could find steadiness in each other without speaking the words aloud. But that delicate peace trembled as Ahuli found fresh tracks near the ridge at sundown, hoofprints too numerous to be harmless. He didn't tell her immediately, not wanting to stir the fear she had just begun to shake off. But Nokomi sensed the tension in his shoulders, and the silence between them grew heavier with each passing hour. Rumors drifted from town, carried by passing riders who eyed Ahuli with suspicion, saying Silas claimed she'd been kidnapped. Judgment gathered like ghostly hands on their backs, whispering dangers neither could ignore. Nokomi's felt guilt coil into her spine. Had she doomed the only man who ever looked at her without seeing something to own or fix? She considered leaving to protect him, though the thought hollowed her chest. Yet before she could decide, a horse screamed into the night, a sound sharp enough to cut through bone, and both of them rose to face what was coming. The red ramblers returned under the pale smear of moonlight, their torches swaying like restless spirits circling the cabin. Silas called out with venom, slurring threats as he demanded she be returned to him. Ahuli stepped forward with his hands open, his calmness a contradiction to the danger surrounding them, his voice a firm river cutting through Silas's chaos. Nokomi's refused to hide this time. She stepped beside Ahuli, her voice shaking but strong as she said she would never go back. Silas lunged, rage twisting him into something nearly unrecognizable, but Ahuli met him with controlled strength. No flourish, no fury, just the solid determination of a man defending what mattered. The struggle lasted only moments before Silas fell into the dirt, panting, humiliated under the pale moon. His gang hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances, and one by one they turned away, their loyalty collapsing beneath the weight of his ugliness. Silas cursed them all, but his voice sounded small now, swallowed by the night. And when he finally fled into the dark, Nokomi's felt the invisible chains that had bound her life for so long shatter quietly within her. Afterward, the world seemed too still, as though holding its breath again. Ahuli tended to the bruises on her arm with trembling hands, his worry rawer than he intended to reveal. She placed her hand over his to steady him, offering the smallest gesture of comfort, a silent confession of trust. In that moment, neither spoke of feelings or futures. The prairie around them hummed with gentle possibility, and that was enough. Curiosity hovered softly, wondering what two people who had survived so much might create together if given time and kindness. And as the first streaks of dawn brushed the sky in pale pinks and golds, they stood side by side, breathing the same quiet morning air, unsure but hopeful in a way they'd never been before. They chose one another without ceremony, without grand proclamations. Under the shade of a wide cottonwood tree, with a few wildflowers tucked into Nokomi's braids, Ahuli spoke his vow in a voice steady as river stone. She answered with a single trembling yes, and the wind rustled through the branches as if offering its blessing. Their new life grew with gentle rhythm, mending fences, sharing coffee brewed over open fire, laughing softly in ways they never had when the world demanded their silence. Nokomi's learned to stand upright in her own worth, and Ahuli learned that tenderness was not a weakness but a kind of bravery he'd long forgotten. And sometimes in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn, curiosity drifted between them still, wondering how many storms they'd survive to reach this tender peace, and how many dawns they would greet together in the days to come. If you listen close, the prairie still remembers their footsteps, two weary souls who ran from the dark only to discover that dawn waits behind the doors we fear knocking on most. Their story, like all stories forged in pain and gentleness, whispers a lesson I offer to you now. You are never a burden for seeking shelter, never wrong for wanting tenderness, and never foolish for believing there is a place where you belong. And if the night feels heavy, trust that the dawn, quiet, patient, and golden, is already walking toward you, just waiting for you to open a door of your own. Guide you into whatever sunrise you choose next.